And I said, no, I need it. I really need it tonight.
In 1995, when Mel Brooks announced Dracula Dead and Loving It, the industry buzzed with excitement. After all, Brooks was returning to the genre he'd conquered, parody, and this time he was taking on Bram Stoker's immortal vampire. It was supposed to be campy, outrageous, and gloriously ridiculous. But behind the scenes, something strange happened. The film that was meant to be a riot of laughter turned into a quiet battleground of clashing philosophies. At the center of it stood two men, Mel Brooks, the grand conductor of chaos, and Frank Langella, the method-trained tragedian who simply couldn't see the joke. Langella wasn't just another actor, he was Broadway royalty. His stage version of Dracula in 1977 had made him a sensation. Women swooned, critics praised, and his dark, magnetic performance redefined the vampire myth. He didn't play Dracula as a monster. He played him as a cursed romantic, seductive, and doomed. So when Brooks cast him for his parody version nearly 2 decades later, everyone assumed it was a masterstroke. Brooks would get his gravitas, Langella would get to poke fun at himself, and audiences would see something new. NBUT from the very first rehearsal. Something was off. Brooks's comedy thrived on rhythm, timing, exaggeration, and absurdity, stacked on top of each other like dominoes. He often described his direction as a dance between disaster and precision. Langella, however, walked in like a Shakespearean general. Every line, every movement, he approached with solemn reverence. He didn't see Dracula as a punchline. He saw him as poetry. Crew members whispered about the tension early on. Brooks, always animated and full of energy, would act out entire scenes, bouncing from wall to wall, while Langella stood still, brows furrowed, dissecting the motivation behind every syllable. Frank, Brooks would say, "This isn't Hamlet, it's ha-ha." But Langella wasn't laughing. NTHE conflict reached its peak during a key rehearsal scene, Dracula confronting Van Helsing. Brooks wanted it to play like an overblown opera, full of dramatic flair and comedic absurdity. Langella, instead, delivered it as if he were performing for the Royal Shakespeare Company. His tone was grave, his expression haunting, his timing non-existent. The silence after each line was suffocating, not because it was powerful, but because it killed the laughter before it could breathe. Finally, Brooks broke the silence. He approached Langella and, with that familiar smirk that had disarmed hundreds of actors before, said, "Frank, maybe loosen it up a little, yeah? Have some fun with it." Langella, polite but visibly irritated, replied, "Do you want me to mock the text?" Brooks didn't blink. "No, I want you to survive it." NTHAT line would go down as one of Mel's most legendary retorts. Quick, sharp, and cutting. But it also marked the beginning of the end. Brooks realized that Langella wasn't wrong. He was just in the wrong film. His seriousness, his respect for the material, was strangling the parody. Brooks needed someone who could live in the chaos, not control it. Behind closed doors, discussions started. The studio was nervous. Langella's name brought prestige. But Brooks, famously protective of his comedic vision, stood firm. "This movie isn't about darkness," he said. "It's about light pretending to be dark." It was the kind of paradox only Mel Brooks could get away with, and it perfectly summed up why Langella didn't fit. Within weeks, a quiet replacement was made. Langella was out. Leslie Nielsen, the master of deadpan absurdity and the face of the Naked Gun series, was in. Publicly, the announcement came wrapped in Hollywood's favorite phrase, creative differences. Privately, it was heartbreak and relief all at once. Langella later spoke about the experience in brief, careful tones. He didn't attack Brooks. He respected him. But his words carried the faint bitterness of an artist who felt misunderstood. Brooks, for his part, never badmouthed Langella. He didn't need to. For Mel, silence was the final verdict. When trust broke or rhythm failed, he didn't argue, he simply moved on. Dracula Dead and Loving It would go on to be one of Brooks's most polarizing films. Critics found it too silly, too broad, too far removed from the brilliance of Young Frankenstein. But Brooks himself always stood by it, calling it a love letter to every bad horror film that made me laugh when I shouldn't have. What few knew, however, was how much of that laughter came from pain. The pain of watching a talented actor drown in seriousness while the comedy gasped for air. Langella's exit taught Brooks something crucial. Even brilliance can be the wrong kind of brilliance. In comedy, tone is everything. It's not just about being funny, it's about being in tune. And when one player insists on rewriting the melody, the symphony falls apart. And Brooks would later joke to friends, "Frank tried to bring gravitas to a man who drinks blood from a straw. It's like serving caviar at a hot dog stand." The line was funny, but it also carried melancholy, because deep down, Brooks admired Langella's intensity. He just knew that intensity had no home in his mad musical universe. Years later, when asked in an interview if he'd ever consider working with Langella again, Brooks smiled wistfully and said, "No, he's a wonderful actor. Just not my kind of lunatic." NTHAT, in a sense, was Mel Brooks's credo. His films weren't random or reckless. They were tight, musical, perfectly structured explosions of laughter, and that structure required trust. Every actor had to surrender to the madness, to trust Mel's rhythm, his pace, his instinct. Langella couldn't do that, not because he was stubborn, but because he believed in control, and Brooks believed in surrender. It's one of the strangest ironies of filmmaking. Two geniuses, both right in their own way, destroying a collaboration that could have been legendary. Langella wanted to dignify comedy, Brooks wanted to liberate it. Between those two desires, the bridge collapsed. And in the years that followed, whenever Brooks told stories of his films, he rarely mentioned Langella by name. Not out of spite, but out of quiet regret. In his mind, the best actors were those who could leap without looking, who could trust that his madness had method. And that's why, for Mel Brooks, Frank Langella became more than a casting misfire. He became a reminder that comedy, when stripped of surrender, becomes tragedy. And tragedy, no matter how beautifully performed, has no place in a world built to laugh at the dark. NFOR Brooks, every film was a circus, wild, precise, and unpredictable. But one rule always stood unbroken. You either dance to the rhythm or you're gone. Frank Langella, magnificent and misplaced, never learned the dance. And Mel Brooks, the maestro who could forgive almost anything but disharmony, quietly closed the curtain. When the credits rolled on Dracula, Dead and Loving It, Langella's name was nowhere to be found. But behind the laughter and the lunacy, his shadow lingered, a reminder of what happens when comedy meets control and neither one agrees to bow. When Mel Brooks first met Gene Wilder, it wasn't in a casting office or a studio boardroom. It was backstage, in that magical chaos where scripts are still warm and dreams are still possible. The two were cut from the same comedic cloth, one loud and explosive, the other gentle and simmering. Mel was the storm, Gene was the calm before it. Together, they made the kind of magic that Hollywood rarely allows, lightning bottled in friendship. Their first collaboration, The Producers, 1967, was an act of trust as much as art. Brooks was still proving himself as a director, and Wilder, sensitive, intelligent, almost painfully introspective, was far from the confident legend he'd become. But on that set, something remarkable happened. Mel pushed, Gene yielded. Gene hesitated, Mel encouraged. It was like two mismatched instruments discovering they made perfect harmony when played together. And Brooks once said, "Gene was the only actor I could trust with my unfinished thoughts." That was no small compliment coming from a man who rarely trusted anyone. On set, Brooks would shout ideas mid-take. Wild, half-formed, chaotic. Any other actor would freeze. But Gene? He'd listen, breathe, and transform chaos into genius. That quiet, controlled hysteria that became his signature. The way he could explode into madness without ever losing the soul underneath, that came from understanding Mel's rhythm instinctively. And after The Producers, they reunited for Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein, two films that didn't just redefine comedy, they elevated it. Together, they built worlds where absurdity had depth and laughter had heart. Mel was always the loudest in the room, but he'd admit privately that Gene was his compass. He knew where the heart was, Brooks once said, and he made sure I didn't lose it chasing the laughs. NBUT, every great partnership has a fault line. and theirs began to crack after Young Frankenstein. The film's success was monumental, a perfect storm of artistry, wit, and warmth. But with success came ego, not in arrogance, but in ambition. Gene had stories he wanted to tell, characters he wanted to shape. He was ready to step out from under Mel's shadow, not to escape him, but to prove something to himself. That's when the adventure of Sherlock Holmes' smarter brother entered the picture. It was Gene's first film as writer, director, and star, his way of showing he could orchestrate his own symphony. Naturally, he wanted Mel to produce it. It wasn't just professional courtesy, it was emotional. Gene wanted his friend beside him, his mentor, to bless the next step. But Mel refused. NTHE refusal wasn't cruel, it was protective. Brooks didn't believe Gene was ready to juggle all three roles. He feared failure would crush him, that one bad experience could scar his confidence forever. Mel told him, "You're the best actor I know, but directing is a different animal. It eats you alive." But to Gene, those words weren't protective, they were paternalistic. He didn't hear love. He heard doubt. NTHE conversation ended quietly, but the silence afterward was deafening. Wilder went ahead without Mel. The film was charming, but flawed, a modest success at best. Yet, the damage between them was far greater than the box office could measure. Brooks felt betrayed that Gene hadn't trusted his guidance. Gene felt heartbroken that Mel hadn't trusted his vision. For two men who once finished each other's jokes, they now couldn't finish a conversation. In interviews years later, Mel spoke of the breakup like someone recalling a lost love. "We didn't fight," he said. "We just stopped." There was no dramatic explosion, no public feud, just distance. They would see each other at events, exchange smiles, even hugs, but the creative intimacy was gone. And Wilder, ever the philosopher, described it differently. "Sometimes, you love someone's madness until it becomes your prison." He adored Mel's energy, his uncompromising direction, but he longed for stillness, a space where he could hear his own voice. The tragedy was that neither man was wrong. Mel was protecting what they had. Gene was searching for what he didn't. Despite the silence, Brooks never stopped speaking fondly of Gene. When asked in one interview who his favorite actor was, Mel didn't hesitate. Gene Wilder. Always Gene. Even decades later, the mention of Gene's name softened him. "He was my little brother," Mel said, voice trembling. "He made my words sound smarter than they were. He gave me grace." And Gene, for his part, never lost the affection either. When asked about Mel Brooks during his later years, he smiled wistfully and said, quote, "He was my madness, and I loved him for it." And they reunited once, briefly, at an award ceremony in the early 2000s. The cameras caught them laughing, that familiar rhythm still intact, like time had paused for just a moment. But it was laughter steeped in memory, not rebirth. They never worked together again. When Gene Wilder passed away in 2016, Mel Brooks went silent for a long time. Then, when he finally spoke, the words were simple, but devastating. "Gene was such a dear friend, I can't call him my collaborator anymore. I can only call him my heart." That's the cruel truth of Mel Brooks's world, the one most people never see. For him, comedy wasn't just craft, it was intimacy. Every actor he trusted became part of his emotional architecture. Losing Gene Wilder wasn't like losing a co-star, it was like losing a limb. Brooks often said that trust was the currency of comedy. Without it, every joke is counterfeit. Gene had earned that trust more deeply than anyone ever had, which made the fracture between them all the more painful. It wasn't betrayal in the Hollywood sense. No tabloid drama, no screaming match, just the quiet, slow drift of two souls who once danced perfectly in step, now moving to different rhythms. And in the years that followed, Brooks surrounded himself with laughter, as always. But those closest to him noticed it. A faint pause when Gene's name came up, a sigh before the smile. The wound had healed, but the scar never faded. Because in the end, Mel Brooks could forgive a lot. Arrogance, rebellion, even failure. But he never forgave the silence that follows love unspoken. And in Gene Wilder's absence, that silence became the loudest thing in the room. Unlike Frank Langella or Gene Wilder, Chevy Chase never set foot on a Mel Brooks set, and that, in itself, was no accident. Hollywood executives tried for years to make it happen. They saw the logic. Two titans of comedy, two icons who defined their eras. Brooks had reigned supreme in the 70s, Chase was the smirking face of the 80s. Together, they could have printed gold. But Mel Brooks was never seduced by studio logic. He believed comedy was chemistry, and ego was its poison. In the late 1980s, when Brooks began developing Spaceballs, several studios pushed names that could sell tickets. Chevy Chase, fresh off National Lampoon's Vacation in Fletch, was the crown jewel. His sarcasm, his self-assured charm. To executives, he was the obvious lead. But to Brooks, he was the wrong kind of funny. "He's not acting," Mel said privately. "He's waiting for everyone else to stop talking so he can prove he's the smartest man in the room." NTHAT, one sentence sealed Chase's fate. NFOR Mel. Comedy wasn't a competition. It was an ensemble. A perfectly tuned band where every performer played for the laugh, not for the spotlight. Brooks came from a time when comedians were collaborators. Sid Caesar, Carl Reiner, Madeline Kahn, each brought their brilliance to serve a bigger rhythm. He believed the best joke in the world meant nothing if it broke the harmony of the scene. Chevy Chase, meanwhile, had built his reputation on the opposite. He was sharp, fast, and perpetually in control. His humor came from detachment, from being the only sane man watching the madness unfold. Brooks's humor came from joining the madness. In Mel's films, everyone was insane, and the comedy thrived because nobody stood above it. NTHE clash wasn't personal, it was philosophical. But in Hollywood, philosophies often sound like feuds. Word spread that Brooks didn't like Chevy Chase. Some claimed it was jealousy, others said it was mutual disdain. The truth was simpler. Brooks respected Chase's success but distrusted his energy. On set, Mel needed surrender, and Chevy never surrendered. It wasn't that Brooks refused to work with stars. He worked with plenty of egos in his time. But he had a sharp radar for those who couldn't blend into the chaos. In Spaceballs, for example, Rick Moranis and John Candy weren't just funny, they were team players. Moranis, as Dark Helmet, made himself ridiculous without hesitation. Candy, as Barf, turned slapstick into art. Every actor, no matter how famous, followed Mel's lead like musicians reading his comedic sheet music. Brooks knew that if Chevy Chase were there, that delicate rhythm would collapse. Behind closed doors, studio executives begged him to reconsider. "He's a box office guarantee," one insisted. Mel's reply was legendary. "So is diarrhea, but I don't want it in my movie." Crude? Yes. Honest? Entirely. And Brooks wasn't being cruel. He was being consistent. His loyalty was to laughter, not leverage. He'd rather risk a flop with the right spirit than a hit with the wrong soul. Chase, for all his brilliance, represented a type of comedy Brooks despised, the comedy of one-upmanship. Mel's humor was musical. Chevy's was monologue. They were two virtuosos, but in different keys. NTHE, two men met only once at a Hollywood dinner party. A mutual acquaintance introduced them, joking that they should finally bury the hatchet. Chase extended his hand. Brooks smiled politely but kept it brief. They exchanged pleasantries, even a few jokes, but the conversation never found rhythm. Each was used to commanding attention, and neither one yielded. By the end of the night, Brooks turned to a friend and said, "Nice guy, wrong planet." And over the years, the idea of a Brooks-Chase collaboration became one of those what-ifs whispered in Hollywood circles, like Hitchcock directing a musical or Kubrick making a romantic comedy. But for Brooks, some doors stayed closed for a reason. NHE later explained it best in an interview, "I don't hate Chevy Chase. I just know what happens when the wrong energy walks into the right movie. It's like inviting thunder to play the violin." And that was the essence of Mel Brooks, his understanding that comedy was fragile and one unchecked ego could drown an entire orchestra. Chase wasn't banned, he was simply unwelcome in a world where self-awareness killed the joke. And in the end, Mel didn't need Chevy Chase, and Chase didn't need Mel Brooks. But in that mutual avoidance lay something quietly poetic, a rare instance in Hollywood where two powerful men recognized they'd ruin each other's rhythm. NFOR Mel Brooks, comedy was trust. For Chevy Chase, comedy was dominance. And in Brooks's symphony of laughter, there was never room for a soloist who refused to listen. Harvey Korman was one of the few actors who could make Mel Brooks laugh uncontrollably. That wasn't easy. Mel had seen every gag, every pratfall, every punchline known to mankind. But Harvey? He had timing in his bones and mischief in his eyes. He could take the simplest line and turn it into a three-act play. To Mel, he was gold, until the very thing that made him brilliant started breaking the bond between them. When Brooks first cast Harvey in Blazing Saddles, 1974, he knew exactly what he was getting, a master of controlled chaos. Korman had already built a reputation as the cornerstone of the Carol Burnett show, where his constant corpsing, breaking character mid-scene from laughing became part of his charm. He was the guy who could improvise his way out of disaster and still land the punchline like he'd rehearsed it 100 times. Mel loved that spirit. He thought, "This man is a natural for my madness," and he was. Yacedly Lamar, the scheming, effeminate villain of Blazing Saddles, Korman gave one of the most absurdly perfect performances of the decade. He balanced villainy with vulnerability, arrogance with idiocy. His delivery of lines like, "My mind is a raging torrent," was pure art, deliberate, pompous, and ridiculously funny. Brooks adored watching him work. He'd pace behind the camera muttering, "He gets it, he gets it." NBUT comedy, especially Brooksian comedy, was never static. It thrived on tension, energy, and the absolute surrender of ego. That's where things began to shift. By the time High Anxiety rolled around in 1977, Harvey's comedic instincts were sharper than ever, and so was his confidence. Too sharp, perhaps. NHIGH Anxiety was Brooks's loving tribute to Alfred Hitchcock, a film that walked a tightrope between parody and homage. Every scene had to hit a precise tone, silly but suspenseful, and for that kind of rhythm, Mel needed total obedience to direction. He used to say, "If you miss one beat, the whole joke falls off the cliff." Korman, however, wasn't wired to obey. Coming from the Carol Burnett show, he was used to improvising, to finding his rhythm in the moment, to letting a line breathe or twist or mutate until it found its funniest form. On Brooks's set, that freedom didn't exist. Mel's scripts were surgical. Every pause, every scream, every twitch was written like music notes. Their first clash came during a scene in High Anxiety where Korman's character, the lecherous Dr. Montague, berates his secretary. Brooks wanted it sharp and rhythmic, each insult landing like a snare drum. But Korman kept altering the lines, elongating pauses, finding his own beats. The crew laughed, the takes worked, but Mel wasn't laughing. "And cut," he said. "It's good, but it's not mine." NTHAT moment said everything. NFOR Brooks. Filmmaking was about surrendering to the vision, not competing with it. For Korman, comedy was a living thing. You didn't cage it, you danced with it. The two men respected each other too much to explode, but the tension was visible. Brooks, ever the perfectionist, started tightening his control. Korman, feeling constrained, pushed harder to prove his instincts were right. The set became a quiet tug-of-war. Laughter on screen, silence between takes. Still, High Anxiety worked. Critics applauded Korman's performance, and Brooks called him a genius wrapped in velvet and chaos. But underneath that praise, a rift was forming. And after High Anxiety, Mel invited Korman for a role in History of the World, Part 1, 1981. Harvey agreed, but the spark had dimmed. What once felt like collaboration now felt like compromise. Korman reportedly showed up to set late on several days, frustrated by endless reshoots and Brooks's tendency to rewrite jokes on the fly. Mel, meanwhile, felt Harvey was losing discipline, that the improvisational spirit he once loved had turned into rebellion. One afternoon, after a particularly long shooting day, Mel pulled Harvey aside. He told him, gently but firmly, "You're the funniest man I know, but you're not listening anymore." Harvey didn't argue. He just smiled, nodded, and said, "Maybe I'm hearing a different tune." NTHAT was the last time they worked together. Publicly, Brooks never spoke ill of him. He continued to call Korman one of the best comedic actors of all time, but privately, he admitted to friends, Harvey brought brilliance, but it always came with resistance. And in Mel's universe, Resistance was a virus that could spread. His sets functioned like orchestras. One out-of-sync player and the whole thing fell flat. Corman, for his part, never expressed anger either. In later interviews, he referred to Brooks as a mad scientist of laughter, adding, "You don't argue with the man who built the lab." But that humility carried a trace of sadness, because deep down, Harvey knew he'd lost not just a director, but a creative soulmate. NTHE irony? Brooks adored working with actors who challenged him, as long as they challenged him within the world he'd built. Madeline Kahn could improvise entire bits, but always in rhythm. Gene Wilder could rewrite lines, but always with reverence. Harvey, however, had crossed the invisible line. He'd stopped serving the rhythm and started steering it. And then for Mel Brooks, that was the unforgivable sin. NTO him. Filmmaking was a form of trust. Not blind obedience, but faith in the director's madness. If he said, "Scream before the punchline," you screamed. If he said, "Trip on the second syllable," you tripped. It wasn't control, it was choreography. And when Harvey started choreographing his own dance, Mel quietly closed the curtain. In later years, when Brooks reminisced about his actors, he'd often pause when Harvey's name came up. "Oh, Harvey," he'd sigh. "He could make me cry laughing, and then just make me cry." NTHAT was the paradox of Harvey Korman, the man who could turn every line into a masterpiece but couldn't stop himself from polishing it once it already shone. His need for perfection clashed with Mel's command of imperfection. Brooks thrived on chaos. Korman tried to tame it. NTWO geniuses, one rhythm and no way to share it. And after their split, Korman continued working steadily, especially in television. He remained beloved, his comedic instincts as sharp as ever. Brooks went on to make more films, each time surrounding himself with actors who surrendered completely. Marty Feldman, Dom DeLuise, Madeline Kahn, the faithful few who understood his rhythm by heart. NBUT among them all, none could replace Harvey. Because despite everything, the clashes, the control, the quiet heartbreak, Mel Brooks knew what he'd lost, a partner who could make him laugh like a child and drive him mad like a rival. That's the double-edged truth about comedy. It's born from friction, but too much friction burns the art away. And then for Mel Brooks, Harvey Korman became that lesson carved in memory. Brilliance must bend, or it breaks. By the late 1980s, Mel Brooks had seen it all. The highs, the chaos, the betrayals, and the heartbreaks. Hollywood adored him, critics studied him, and comedians worshipped him. But if there was one name that truly tested his philosophy of comedy, it was Jerry Lewis. To the world, Lewis was a god, a pioneer who had reshaped comedy with elastic expressions, slapstick mayhem, and unrelenting confidence. But to Mel Brooks, he represented something dangerous. A man so convinced of his own genius that he left no space for anyone else to breathe. And it all began with a studio suggestion. Mel was preparing Life Stinks, a project deeply personal to him. Unlike his usual parodies, this was a fable about empathy, ego, and the absurdity of wealth. The studio executives, however, saw it differently. "You know who'd be perfect for this?" they said. Jerry Lewis. And Brooks didn't even hesitate. He leaned back in his chair, smirked, and said, "Perfect? For what? The explosion?" NTHE room went silent. The execs laughed awkwardly, assuming Mel was joking. But he wasn't. He'd admired Jerry Lewis from afar, respected his impact, his innovation, even his nerve, but he knew instinctively that their worlds could never coexist. Mel's comedy thrived on ensemble energy, on rhythm shared between actors, on the invisible thread of trust that connected one performer to another. Jerry, on the other hand, played comedy like a solo concerto. It was all about him, his timing, his voice, his reflection in the audience's laughter. Still, for the sake of diplomacy, Mel agreed to a dinner meeting. One night, one dinner. Just to see. They met at a Beverly Hills restaurant, the kind of place where every table had a producer, every waiter was an actor, and every conversation hummed with deals and promises. Mel arrived early, sipping water, already rehearsing how he might politely decline the idea of working together. When Jerry entered, the entire room seemed to shift toward him. He didn't walk. He arrived. Dressed in black, gold cufflinks flashing, grin already in place, he carried an aura of perpetual performance. "Mel Brooks," he said loudly enough for the nearby tables to look over. "The only man in Hollywood who thinks he's funnier than me." Mel smiled politely. "I don't think that," he said. "I know it." It was the perfect Brooksian comeback. Fast, sharp, effortless. The kind of humor that disarmed people. But not Jerry. Lewis just stared, expression unreadable, before bursting into laughter that shook the table. "You're okay, Mel. You're okay," he said. "I can work with you." NTHAT sentence. "I can work with you." Sealed Mel's decision. It wasn't, "we can work together." It was dominance disguised as charm. And from that moment, Mel Brooks knew it was over before it began. NTHE dinner unfolded exactly as Mel feared. Jerry talked endlessly about his films, his innovations, his sacrifices for comedy. He compared himself to Chaplin, to Keaton, to God. Mel, usually the loudest presence in any room, found himself muted, half listening, watching this legendary man inflate his own myth with every anecdote. At one point, Mel tried steering the conversation toward Life Stinks, explaining its tone, a satirical but humane reflection on greed and redemption. "It's not just laughs," he said. "It's about people rediscovering their humanity through absurdity." Jerry nodded, then interrupted. "You know, I could rewrite that," he said casually. "Punch it up, give it a soul. You need a little heart, Mel, a little Jerry magic." Mel's fork paused mid-air. "A little Jerry magic?" he repeated softly, almost to himself. Then he smiled, nodded, and said, "Well, Jerry, I'm afraid my films already have a soul. It's just not yours." NTHAT was the last dinner they ever had. And after that night, Mel refused to even entertain the idea again. When the studio followed up, suggesting maybe they could blend both comedic worlds, Mel simply said, "No, my world doesn't have a throne." And it wasn't personal hatred. It was principle. Brooks had spent his life crafting comedy that belonged to everyone on set, where the prop man's timing could be as crucial as the leading actor's line. With Jerry Lewis, that equilibrium was impossible. Mel once told a friend, "Jerry is a one-man army, but comedy isn't war, it's jazz." Behind the scenes, word spread about the failed meeting. Some joked that it was a collision of planets, two comic titans whose gravitational pulls canceled each other out. Others thought Mel had missed an opportunity to unite two eras of comedy. But Brooks never wavered. He would rather work with a humble unknown than a self-crowned genius. And interestingly, Lewis himself later made subtle jabs in interviews, calling Brooks the kind of director who likes to control every laugh. An ironic statement, given Jerry's reputation for doing exactly that. When asked if he and Mel could ever collaborate, Jerry quipped, "Only if he agrees to take notes from me." Mel, when told about the comment, reportedly laughed and said, "That's like Chaplin taking dance lessons from Groucho." And yet, beneath the humor, there was respect. A strange, grudging kind. Mel never denied Lewis's influence on comedy. He called him an inventor of chaos. But in Mel's eyes, Jerry's chaos had no compass. It was noise without melody. For Brooks, laughter had structure. Even madness had a rhythm. And Jerry, for all his brilliance, refused to play in tune. And years later, when Life Stinks was released with Mel himself in the lead role, the critics were divided. Some loved its odd sincerity, others didn't get it. But what few knew was that the film's title carried a private double meaning. In moments of reflection, Mel would joke to friends, "If I'd worked with Jerry, it wouldn't just be the movie, life would have stunk." NTHE irony was that both men, in their own ways, wanted the same thing, to make people laugh and feel something true beneath the laughter. But Mel sought truth through connection, while Jerry sought it through control. One led with ensemble, the other with ego. And that difference defined their divide. And in the years that followed, when asked about actors he couldn't work with, Brooks would never list names publicly. He didn't need to. But when one interviewer mentioned Jerry Lewis in passing, Mel's answer was telling N. "He's a genius," Brooks said softly. "But genius isn't the same as grace. And grace is what makes comedy human." NTHAT was Mel Brooks in a single sentence, a man who saw humor as empathy, not ego, rhythm, not rivalry. He believed laughter only meant something when it was shared, when every performer, from the biggest star to the smallest extra, felt the same pulse. And that was why Jerry Lewis, for all his brilliance, would never fit into the Brooksian universe. Because in Mel's world, no one got to be the center of gravity, not even the stars. In the end, Mel didn't hate Jerry Lewis. He simply didn't forgive what Jerry represented. The idea that comedy could belong to one man alone, NFOR Mel Brooks, that was the only real sin.